At the round earth's imagined corners blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinites of souls, and to your scattered bodies go. Hello, traveler. My name is Virgil. Today I want to talk about Philip Jose Farmer's 1971 To Your Scattered Bodies Go, the first book in the Riverworld saga, or series. So what's Riverworld about? A sexy-time book translator gets reincarnated in a nudist colony. He does some drugs and decides to go on a very long float trip. Along the way, a Nazi tries to recruit him, but instead of doing that, he decides to spend a lot of time drowning himself. Eventually, he gets to play half a game of 20 questions, and then he tries to see if he can make it work with Alice in Wonderland. As ridiculous as that might sound, it's all actually very true. A very fast-moving novel. The book itself is not particularly long, 220-ish pages in this format. Not a very long read, but a very packed read. There's a lot that goes on in the story. Farmer has a good sense of not getting too heavy into exposition and to keep the story moving, to keep you interested. And I think that's a characteristic of Farmer's writing in general. Not that I like Philip Jose Farmer, but I can't claim to be extremely well read in all his works. I've read this book. I've read The Fabulous Riverboat, which is a sequel to this. I've read a short story or two of his as well. Farmer is very much a pulp writer that doesn't have a lot of the guilty pleasure stuff that you sometimes get with pulp writing. What I mean by that is a lot of the classic pulp writers have a problem here or there or with something that kind of make it sort of like, well, I do like this stuff. But there's a couple things about this book that I'm not crazy about. I kind of talked a little bit about that with like Edgar Rice Burroughs, for example, when I talked about The Return of Tarzan in that last sort of vlog video I did not too long ago. Farmer writes in that sort of pacing, but he tends to be maybe a little bit more introspective than they are. Not super introspective, but a little bit more introspective. But it doesn't have a lot of those problems that you might otherwise have from other writers. So the book was published in 1971, and Farmer won a Hugo in 1972, which is a science fiction book award for this novel. It was the third Hugo that he won. He won another Hugo for The Lovers in... I can't remember the year for that. And he also won another one for The Riders of the Purple Wage. The book, The Lovers, is credited with being one of the very first books to really deal with sexuality and sex in science fiction. Farmer was always kind of like pushing that boundary in a sense. I mean, the entry, not this book, but a different book that he has for the Barlow's Guide reading challenge I have, is specifically deals with, intimacy with... I'm not quite certain, but I believe it's with the human and a plant. But I'll have to get to that when I read it. Farmer does have a history of writing good science fiction. He did kind of struggle a bit with trying to become a writer. I know after, actually this is a funny story. In 1952, he wrote an original version of the Riverworld saga called O for the Flesh. Now, he submitted that early version to a novel writing contest. The grand prize was $4,000. $4,000 in money in 1952 is worth about $45,000 for 2023. So a decent amount of money. Farmer won that. He won that contest. That novel was supposed to get published. The manuscript got lost. Farmer never got his money. Obviously, the book was never published. Farmer spent a lot of time waiting, and it just never happened. He actually, I think, tried to become a professional writer, and I think based on the money that he was supposed to get and was trying to make it, and it just didn't work out. So I think he gave up and became a technical writer and spent a lot of time sort of like writing science fiction in his part-time before, right about the time when this book was published, he finally went back and became like a full-time writer again. After basically a lifetime of, blue-collar work or white-collar. I don't really know what kind of collar we wear. Maybe he didn't wear a collar. What do I know? I don't know about technical writing. Let's keep moving. But I'll talk a little bit more about the weird sort of publishing sort of hiccups that the Riverworld have. That's not the only little issue that Farmer encountered with this story. But this story itself is about a world where all of humanity gets resurrected. It's this big river valley, right? Everyone is reborn naked and hairless. They have a cylinder about their wrist, and this cylinder can be placed in this large stone mushroom-like structure that has these depressions in it. And you put your grail, which is what they call these cylinders, you put your grail in this depression, and about 3 times a day, it'll be filled with food and drink. Sometimes you'll get clothes in there. Sometimes you'll get like cigarettes and things like that, or a lighter. And then, which is kind of interesting. And I think Farmer does kind of address the fact that it's very like modern American-ish sort of thinking about what people want, but that's okay. And they also get this dream gum, which is like a narcotic or a hallucinogen. At the very first night on the Riverworld, everyone sort of chews this gum not knowing that it's a narcotic. And there's this like giant crazy orgy thing that happens, and it's weird, and everybody's kind of like, a lot of people stay away from the gum from then after, and lots of craziness happens. Before I jump all the way to that, I should mention a few of the things about kind of the setup to Riverworld, because there's a little bit of time, maybe a lot, spent describing the setup, so you understand kind of like the rules of Riverworld. And it takes a little while for all this to be described. There's this big river valley, where the river itself, the Riverworld, is about a mile across normally. It does sometimes swell up to like 3 miles and kind of form a small lake. And sometimes it narrows through a canyon, maybe like when it goes and makes a bend. But for the most part, it's about a mile wide. Then there's usually plains on either side of the river that are about 2 miles, and then another maybe 2 miles of like forested hills. And then finally it gives way to these really tall, very sheer mountains that are, for the most part, impassable without a significant amount of work. The Riverworld is essentially resource poor. I mean, there's usually like bamboo or something like that growing, so that you can make like wooden structures. And there's some stone and flint and things that can be used, but like for metals, stuff that you would need to make more advanced like electronics or technology is very, very difficult to find, or if not impossible. A couple of the notes about the grails: only you can open your own grail and to get access to it. And eventually a thing called grail slavery sort of starts to take place, where someone is basically enslaved, and they're allowed to put their grail in the stone and get it recharged, and then they have to give the contents, or most of the contents, to a leader of some sort who collects it and hoards these sort of supplies for trade and things like this. Everyone is born hairless on Riverworld. Now, the hair on their head eventually grows, but men never are able to grow facial hair again, which I think is just a strange. I'm not really sure what is going on there, why that was a thing. I don't know. The other thing is that everyone who's reincarnated on this Riverworld is no younger than 5 and no older than 25. People who are young will age up to 25, and I believe that they just sort of like freeze at that age, and they just stay 25 after that. But this river valley itself winds back and forth across the surface of this planet. No one has a bird's eye view per se, but it's essentially surmised that there's a mouth of this river somewhere and that there's an outlet. Almost no one has seen those places or is able to get access to them because there's some difficulty usually associated with it. And the river itself is incredibly long, and the people who are reincarnated on this river come from all walks of life and all times. You have anyone from Neanderthals to the most modern human that I think comes to like somewhere in the early 2000s, where maybe humanity had a problem. We get examples from both those time periods. The story follows Sir Richard Francis Burton, who is known for translating the Kama Sutra, the Perfume Garden, which is sort of like the Asian version of the Kama Sutra, the Arabian Nights, and he also was the maybe the only or the first person to sneak into Mecca at a time when doing so and not being Muslim was like punishable by death. So he was a very literate person, and he was also maybe a little, his choices were interesting, but I think part of it was that maybe nobody else would, like, it was too taboo to sort of translate those things or to mess with those things. And so he was very adventurous in the fact that he would do that, and literate, and also just had adventures. He went and explored quite a bit. So he's the main character that we follow. We also encounter Alice Hargraves. I don't know if Hargraves was her married name or not. But in any event, she is the basis of the fictional Alice in Wonderland. Now, the historical Alice Hargraves and the Alice Hargraves in To Your Scattered Bodies Go is not the same person as Alice in Wonderland. I mean, she was like the inspiration in name. Lewis Carroll like knew this person, named this character after her, but there's nothing in her personality and the things that she does. It's not like cluing you into things about her. Kass, who is a Neanderthal, Kass attaches himself to Burton fairly early, sort of like recognizing Burton's sort of natural leadership qualities. It kind of becomes like a subordinate in a sense, like he looks up to him and follows him and protects him and works with him and always kind of wants to throw in with Burton. And that's sort of I guess that's a classic pulp trope too, isn't it? Sort of this native to a primitive culture or area, sort of throwing themselves in with a usually a Caucasian explorer. That's a kind of a pulp trope that I think Farmer is kind of messing with a little bit there. Monat, who is an alien from Tau Ceti. Monat and some other emissaries from his planet were visiting Earth, I want to say in the very late 90s or early 2000s in the timeline of the book. They were kind of like just talking and sort of, communicating with humans and sort of, extending the olive leaf. Is it word? Olive leaf? Olive branch. maybe the branch had leaves on it too. I mean, you never know. Monat himself gives an interview in which he reveals that his people have the secret to eternal life, but that they don't use it. This sort of starts like kind of like a riot where people try to break into their spaceship and get the secret of life. Monat and his other compatriots don't have the secret of life. They don't know that secret. It's not something that was given to them or that they have access to. So a lot of his companions are killed. Monat kind of less out of self-preservation, but more out of preservation for his people, because he thinks in these last few moments as they're breaking into the ship and he's sort of barricaded himself in, that humans are going to steal his ship and maybe go and attack his planet and kill his own people in the future, sets off a device which causes a huge problem for humanity. And lastly, we have Peter J. Frigate. Peter J. Frigate is a modern American who actually remembers and recognizes Monat, though he never knew him in real life, but he remembers him from TV. And Frigate is sort of like our window into this world. He kind of identifies historical figures. He is very literate and knows a lot of different languages. And so he's able to translate a lot for the other characters when they encounter people who don't speak the same language. And sort of like to fill the reader in. Maybe if the reader doesn't know who that person is, it's sort of like is that knowledge base. Now, it's interesting to note that Frigate also has the same birth year as Farmer. He also has the same initials as Farmer, P.J.F. I'm not quite certain that Frigate is a self-insertion by Farmer. He could be. I don't quite think that he is. But there is one more thing. He has an encounter at some point with an editor of his who jilted him. And I know that Farmer had some sort of a problem with an editor or publisher of his books who had done him dirty somehow. Not, I think, the one who never paid him the money, but I'm not certain about that, actually. I know this from a reference in a Harlan Ellison foreword, and I don't quite remember what that person's name was, so I can't say if that's the person we're exactly talking about here, but I do kind of want to look into that. So that's the most important cast, the cast that you need to know. Burton gathers this group together, along with a number of others who are somewhat nameless or who have very minor roles. He sort of determines that, I want to go to the mouth of this river. Now, at the very beginning of the book, we see Burton on his deathbed, and he dies. And there's a moment between when he dies and when he's resurrected on the Riverworld. He's the only person that he ever talks to who had this same experience. Above him, on both sides, below him, and as far as he could see, bodies floated. They were arranged in vertical and horizontal rows. The up and down ranks were separated by red rods, slender as broomsticks, one of which was 12 inches from the feet of the sleepers, and the other 12 inches from their heads. Each body was spaced about 6 feet from the body above and below, and on each side. The rods came up from an abyss without bottom, and soared into an abyss without ceiling. The grayness into which the rods and the bodies, up and down, right and left, disappeared was neither the sky nor the earth. There was nothing in the distance except the lackluster of infinity. That scene is very vivid. In fact, it's probably one of the most memorable scenes in the book. It happens very early. The cover of this book slightly alludes to it. What Burton sees in that in-between time tells him that this is not some sort of divine resurrection, that there's something, that this was planned. There's a force behind this. And that is the drive behind him going upriver to see where this river starts, to see if he can find these sort of the people who set this whole thing in motion. Along the way, they get captured and enslaved. They also finally encounter someone who starts to sort of feed into the mystery side of this a little bit of who made the Riverworld. The early tone of the book is very much like an apocalyptic sort of novel to me. It reminds me of like those early days you get in a like a zombie apocalypse movie where everything's crazy and everything, and people don't know how the rules work, and people are just doing nutso stuff before everything starts to settle down, and people sort of like start to form like governments or organizations, right, to protect each other and to set rules in place. And those parts are always fun in those books, but as we all have seen in those zombie movies, after that initial chaos wears off, it can be difficult to maintain that level of interest. Farmer solves it here in Riverworld is that mystery of what's going on with Riverworld is what sort of takes over. And Farmer encounters an ethical who starts to clue him in that there is something else going on, that there is more to it, and that he needs to continue his journey. At the very end of the book, Burton gets sort of an interview scene where he gets some of his questions answered. Now, normally in a scene like that, I would think that getting those questions answered sort of becomes anticlimactic because it's sort of like the question itself is always more interesting than the answer, that, you know, because you can kind of like wonder about it. And so usually those sorts of like reveal scenes are like, okay. And then in retrospect, you're like, yeah, it was all after that. It kind of like changed. At least that's how I find it. I don't find that to be true here. It sort of says, well, maybe you were thinking this, but here's some other questions that you weren't thinking about that are still very important or very compelling, that really are, you know, the next layer, so to speak, of questions. The goals are still sort of like achievable or need to be achieved, but you don't exactly know what the result will be if you achieve them. I liked it. I liked it a lot. It made it very, very convincing and very easy for me to want to read the next book, which is The Fabulous Riverboat. Now, I will say I have read The Fabulous Riverboat before a long time ago, so I don't remember everything about it. I'm rereading it right now. And I also read a short story that's related to this series, but that does not feature any of these characters explicitly. That story, which is just called Riverworld, is kind of like like an interesting twist on a sort of like a savior type story. The setting of Riverworld is very much like is this utopian setting, right? Your wants are all taken care of. You don't have to worry about food and drink anymore. You don't have to worry about dictatorships or like corrupt politicians running the show anymore, or like controlling, you know, whether you can do something or not, or live or not. Religion is basically debunked. To be a priest of any sort in the early days of Riverworld is really not a good thing. A lot of them kind of put their heads down and pretend that they weren't. But what's great about this utopian setting that Farmer sets up is that it just starts rotting right away. It's like this unrefrigerated version of a utopia. Or you could think about this utopia as being like, I don't know, like a gelatin that just slowly decongeals and liquefies into the reality that we all know. I do want to point out that the historical Richard Burton did write an anti-Semitic work, and that Farmer's aware of it, and he discusses it and addresses it, and I think he handles it in a good way. He doesn't spend too much time on it or get too preachy, but he also doesn't like undersell it or kind of dismiss it. So I think that he does a good job of handling that. So if you perhaps know of Richard Burton in an unfavorable light, I think that you'll find that even though he's the protagonist here and that he's looked on favorably, that not everything he has done is like whitewashed here. And in fact, that's pretty true for Farmer in general. He doesn't tend to whitewash his characters. He sort of shows them warts and all. So Riverworld is again sort of like this. It's kind of has that like mega structure type setting, very similar, as I think I've mentioned before, to like Jack Chalker's Midnight at the Well of Souls or Larry Niven's Ringworld. You know, it's part of like this sort of culture shock that everyone has when they show up on this planet, and like all the rules have changed. The things that you understood and knew are now different, and a new set of rules is in play. The thing that's interesting in the way that Riverworld kind of does a little something different with that is that everyone here is a fish out of water. Nobody really knows how the rules work. In Midnight at the Well of Souls, it's like there's already an established population there that sort of understands how things work, and people have to integrate themselves into it. Here, it's just sort of like random people in history sort of show up all over the place, and you have to cope with them. And yes, there's some really ugly and nasty people in history, and yes, they're back. Actually kind of fun to see these sort of like historical villains that we have sort of get their comeuppance, so to speak, or to, at least that they are fought against. And I think that that's kind of an interesting dynamic that Farmer kind of messes with. And I didn't mention it before, so I'm just going to put it here because here it is. The other thing about Riverworld is that there's no animal life or insects on the planet. There's the only other life besides the humans on here are the fish that are in the river itself. No birds, no insects, no animals. So nobody has the advantage of like horses or anything like that. So for me, I think that Riverworld is probably a really strong 8. I love this book a lot. It's a lot of fun to read. It's like a really, really great, well-written pulp fiction with a really interesting science fiction concept. I'd love to say it's a 9, but I'm really stingy about 9s. And in fact, for a 10, it's like, I don't even know that I've read a 10. So I'm not even really sure why I have a 10 scale if it's like almost unachievable. And honestly, like maybe I've said this before, I really wouldn't even probably bother to talk about a book that was under a 5. And even a 5, it's like, I must have forced myself to read that book because I probably would have just put it down if I thought it was that. But Riverworld is a strong 8, which is for me, is pretty good. So I guess I should say most of the books that I would read, most of the books I'm going to talk about are going to be 6, 7s, or 8s. So I'm really not really sure why I have a 10 scale. I don't know. It made sense to me when I did it, and it still makes sense to me when I think about it. This story can't quite break into the 9 for me, but it's about as close as it can get to breaking into a 9. So I think this is great. If you like pulp type stories, this is a great choice. And if you like science fiction, this is a great choice. And if you like them both, this is an amazing choice. So for me, I love this book. This is great. I really enjoy Farmer. Really can't wait to get into some of his other series. This has been sort of I've had a lot of Farmer books for a long time, and they've kind of been on the back burner. And one of the things I love about doing this stuff is that it kind of gives me a drive to get in there and finally get that stuff read that I've had sitting there for a long time. So I've got a number of Farmer books sitting over there that I'm going to get to. A couple of the notes about Philip Jose Farmer. He was born in 1918 and passed in 2009. Yep, 2009 at 91. So he had a pretty good span there. I think that's pretty fair. He liked to write about historical figures, or like pulp characters. For example, he wrote about Tarzan and Doc Savage. In this book, of course, he's talking about Richard Burton and Alice Hargraves and a number of others I'm going to withhold from here. But the next book in this series, The Fabulous Riverboat, follows Mark Twain. One last thing about Farmer. He wrote this book, Venus on a Half Shell. He wrote it as Kilgore Trout. And it's also a character that Kurt Vonnegut writes about in his books. Now, Kurt Vonnegut was not happy when this book was published because people thought that he wrote it, not Farmer. Farmer had permission from Vonnegut to write that book. Vonnegut later says that he sort of regrets that decision. Oh, well. But I'd like to find a little bit more out about that. I don't know if there's a whole lot more to that story other than that. I mean, I think there's some talk about like Vonnegut, I guess maybe it was slightly like a publicity stunt, like maybe, and I could kind of see that, an editor, this guy got permission, he's like, let's really sell this and let's pretend like, ooh, and kind of doesn't really mention that it's a pseudonym of somebody else. So I don't know. I think that's kind of funny. And as I said, the Riverworld series had a number of false starts. That 1952 first draft or early draft, I wouldn't say first draft, it was a finished manuscript that won and just became lost, so we don't have that anymore. Farmer went back and wrote it again a few years later, I don't know exactly how much longer later, but somewhere in between then and 71, he rewrote it again, and that manuscript became lost. That manuscript was later found and published in 1983 as The Rivers of Eternity or something just like that. I don't remember the publisher's name either. I'll try to get that stuff up on the screen so I can get it right. I just don't want to break away and go do that research right now. That is sort of like a finished draft that's been cleaned up. It's not really canon to the series. I guess you could say it's a curiosity. I don't think it's ever been reprinted. It's just that single version was printed of it. So if it's something you're really interested, if you really like the Riverworld, that might be something you can go look at. So Farmer went back and he did it again. He wrote it all again and he submitted to Ballantine Books. They turned it down. They said it was too adventure focused. It is kind of adventure focused, but I still think it's pretty good science fiction. So Farmer contacted Frederick Pohl. and Pohl agreed to publish it if Farmer would break it up into parts and he could put it in periodicals that Pohl was an editor for. Farmer did that and published it as 5 stories, and I think some of those stories were even broken into parts for the publication. So those 5 stories are The Day of the Great Shout, which was 1965, Riverworld, 1966, The Suicide Express, 1966, The Felled Star, 1967, and The Fabulous Riverboat, 1971. 4 of those stories went on to become To Your Scattered Bodies Go and The Fabulous Riverboat. Except for the story Riverworld, which I think is kind of funny and makes this whole story a little confusing. That story was just published by itself in a book called Down to the Black Gang, or Down with the Black Gang. The Black Gang, something about gangs. There's gangs going, Down in the Black Gang. I have that book. Actually, I brought it on here earlier, but it's upstairs. And if I go upstairs to get it, I probably won't make it back. So I'm not going to go get it. Anyways, I'll take a picture of it. I don't know. Do you really care? Maybe you do. Anyways, those stories were republished like that. Now, Down in the Black Gang has I think I already said it has sort of like a strange religious tone going on with it, or like riffing on like a religious idea. Yeah. So it was written and lost, written again, lost, written again, broken into parts, published, collected, put back into parts. Which were published separately. Then that second one was found and published again. It's like, Jesus. So the final list of books in the Riverworld series goes like this. To Your Scattered Bodies Go, 1971. The Fabulous Riverboat, 1971. The Dark Design, 1977, The Magic Labyrinth, 1980, and Gods of Riverworld, 1983. Later, it was changed to The Gods of Riverworld. I don't know, it just sounds cooler. Oh, and by the way, that book that was published, that was found later, that manuscript was found in a garage. That's the information I have. It was found in a garage. Doesn't say whose garage, just a garage. So you never know. If you buy a house, look in the garage. It could have a manuscript to one of Farmer's early works. You could be sitting on a gold mine right now if you haven't explored your garage completely. Don't. Leave no garage unturned, people. That's it. My God, I hope I got it all. There was a lot to remember. Thank you very much for watching. I love this series. I really like Philip Jose Farmer. I intend to read more and bring it on here. I don't know that I'm going to do a dedicated video expressly about The Fabulous Riverboat, even though I'm reading it right now. I'll probably do that. I'll probably couple that in with a couple other books and do just sort of more of a vlog type review or something. I don't know. I still don't even know what the hell I'm doing here. So anyways, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, because that's a thing I like to say. And well, I don't really like to say it, but it helps me to be, stuff. Thank you for watching. I appreciate your time. I really do. Honestly. Thank you for appreciating my time. So you can do those things. That appreciates my time. Yes, that Larry Niven and also Robert Heinlein review are coming up that are part of the Barlow's Guide. This was kind of a test run for a slightly more refined review format for those books. I'm getting better. Just wish me luck. Bye.